enchanted abilities. In DCU stories, it was explained that Adolf Hitler got his hands on a Spear of Destiny, used it to create a zone of influence or an impenetrable barrier that would keep the JSA out of Germany. And if anybody did manage to get into Germany, Hitler could use the spear to put those interceptors in his enthrall, basically turn any JSAers into puppets of Hitler. And so the government's mission will be to track down the spear. Hazard, though, decides that he needs to go out and interview people who knew the Spectre back in the 1940s. It's an established fact that the Spectre was one of the so-called costumed mystery men who joined the Justice Society of America. And so Hazard is looking to see if there's any insight as to what might have caused the Spectre to become such a violent, vengeful character in more recent times, specifically in Vltava. And we should note that this story takes place just after Armageddon Inferno. So the JSA have recently returned from the time on the astral plane, and this is a period where a number of the JSAers are finding that the various magics, exposures to radiation that slowed down their aging processes are wearing off. And so some of them look much older than others. Ones like Jay Garrick don't look so bad. It could later be explained that the Speed Force was what was keeping Jay from aging so quickly as others. But certainly Johnny Thunderbolt's looking older. Carter Hall is looking older as well. So Professor Hazard first goes to the home of Johnny Thunder, who is quite forthwith with Hazard, but he doesn't really have a whole lot of useful information for the professor outside of saying that, you know, the Spectre and Johnny's Thunderbolt were pretty well on the same level. But Johnny suggests that Professor Hazard speak with Jay Garrick next. And Jay Garrick, we see, is quite personable with Professor Hazard. He certainly appears willing to share whatever he can with the professor. I should note before I go on that the different JSAers who Hazard interviews are very careful not to mention Jim Corrigan's name. They refer to Spectre as the Spectre, or by a pet nickname they had for him back in the day, Spec. So in Mandrake's beautifully rendered flashback scenes, you will see Jim Corrigan, but everybody's referring to him as Spec. So Jay Garrick basically confirms for Professor Hazard that Hitler did have the Spear of Destiny, and he did use it to create a barrier which not even the Spectre and Jay Garrick could penetrate. And so they had to wait until after the war in Europe had ended, at which point the JSA entered Germany and witnessed the horrific after effects of the concentration camps. They could basically imagine the horrific experiences that are suffered by those who were held in the concentration camps. And Jay recalls that the sight of these camps drove the Spectre into such a rage that it took the combined might of the JSA to hold the Spectre back and to plead with the Spectre not to do anything extreme, but rather to let the lawyers at the trials in Nuremberg do their work and get the justice that was so desperately needed at this time. And Jay tells Hazard that the Spectre did back down, but after that, the Spectre was becoming more and more distant from everybody on the JSA. And so certainly that suggests that this was a point where Corrigan was losing his faith in humanity, and that was one of the things which drove him to really lose his own sense of his own humanity. And Jay's apologetic. He says to Hazard that he really doesn't have anything more to share about the Spectre because he and the Spectre were never really close. But Jay suggests that Hazard next go to Ted Grant, aka Wildcat. And so after a friendly boxing match, Hazard and Wildcat sit down to talk, and Ted Grant relates that back in the 1940s, he, Spack, and Jay Garrick were the best of friends. They would often go out on the town dressed in their best suits. They'd go to a fancy restaurant. Jay would engage in various shenanigans using his speed powers, switching up people's dinner plates, changing bow ties with other male patrons, kissing pretty girls. And the Spectre would join in by making these ghoulish apparitions come out of the other patrons' wine glasses and other alcoholic beverages. And it's really interesting, this piece of information that Ted provides, because it really conflicts with Jay's contention that he and the Spectre were never close. Jay Garrick is one of the most honest people in the DCU. And so it must be something pretty extreme for Jay to fabricate a lie or to fudge the truth. And just thinking about 0 Hour, which was at this point probably a little under a couple of years away, this depiction of Jay Garrick actually lines up quite beautifully with Dan Jurgens' portrayal of Jay Garrick and his views towards Jim Corrigan during 0 Hour. And I've said this before, I imagine Dan Jurgens was reading almost everything that was going on in the DCU at this time. And I'm betting dollars to donuts that Mr. Jurgens read this particular issue number 20 of the Spectre, and said, oh, okay, that's interesting what Ostrander-Mandrake did here. I'm going to keep that in my back pocket, because certainly looking ahead to 0 Hour, it's Jay who's the one who is the most put out with the Spectre. He's the one who feels that the Spectre abandoned the team and should have been there right from the beginning. It is Jay who tracks down the Spectre and rails against him, makes that final appeal for the Spectre to finally get involved in 0 Hour. So here, between this issue and 0 Hour, we can see that Jay was probably quite hurt on a personal level by the Spectre. No doubt Jay felt that he wasn't just being let down by a colleague, he was also being abandoned by someone who he considered a close friend. Well, Ted doesn't really have anything more to share with Hazard. However, Ted does suggest that Hazard next go to the Hall residence and speak with the Golden Age Hawkman and Hawkgirl. And again, we see this beautiful continuity here, and that the way Mr. Ostrander portrays Carter Hall lines up perfectly with the way later writers such as Jeff Johns, David S. Goyer, James Robinson portrayed Carter Hall. Here we see that Carter, even though he's looking much older at this point, he's still very angry. He's angry against the government. He still remembers the McCarthy hearings, which forced the JSA to go into exile. Carter is not happy to have Hazard in his home, but it's Shayera who's the first to open up to Professor Hazard, and she relates a rather sad story about their interaction with the Spectre back in the 1940s. She recalls that at a party after the victory in Europe, various members of the JSA were enjoying drinks and dancing, and Shayera and Carter both noticed that Spec was sitting on his own, looking rather forlorn. At this point, Spec was talking about how alcohol had no effect on him. Everything was different since he was a ghost. He didn't feel things the way other people felt. And so Carter and Shayera both tried to raise his spirits. Shayera invited Spec to dance with her, and Carter said to Spec, "Go ahead. Shayera is tiring me out, and I can't keep asking Jay to dance with her. So why don't you go ahead, Spec?" To which Corrigan agrees. And we see Corrigan and Shayera dancing, and Shayera recalls that Spec was actually a pretty good dancer. But then she started feeling incredibly cold, and she broke away from Spec and ran into her husband's arms. She started crying and saying, "Carter, it's so cold, it's so cold." And Carter is quick to get angry with Corrigan, and he yells at Corrigan, "What have you done to my wife? You've taken away all of her body heat. How dare you?" Upon later reflection, though, Shayera understands that it wasn't the Spectre taking her body heat away. It's because he was a ghost. He was naturally cold. So, because she was making physical contact with him, she got cold. But this incident was enough to make Corrigan blink out of appearance. And the Halls recalled that they didn't see Spectre again until after they returned from the astral plane, and they had learned at this point that their son Hector Hall had died. And so they went to Hector's grave, where they tried calling upon the Spectre, and he appeared before them, not appearing too pleased that they called upon him. And Shayera recalls that the Spectre was quite curt with them, asking, "What do you want?" And Shayera explains to Hazard that she asked the Spectre to bring her son back. To which the Spectre said, "Well, no, I can't. There's no soul. He's gone." And even though Carter got angry and also protested, the Spectre was very nonchalant, very aloof, basically refused to consider the request, and then disappeared. And that was their last interaction with the Spectre. And so Hazard thanks them for this information, and he leaves. He next goes to the home of Wesley Dodds, aka the Golden Age Sandman. And Dodds is able to confirm that the Spear of Destiny is something which can cause extreme harm to the Spectre. And we learned that Dodds is the one who remembers the events of Last Days of the Justice Society exactly the way they happened. You have to keep in mind that the Last Days of the Justice Society took place during that merged Earth period. So it took place before that last wave of chronal energy which swept over the unified Earth and ushered in the post-crisis era. And so now Hazard realizes that the Spear of Destiny